There's a type of medieval food that was incredibly popular and isn't really eaten very much these days. It would also allow you to pay your rent. Have you got a clue what it might be? Put your answers in the comments below. Eels were an immensely popular and important dish in medieval England. They were widely eaten, and some records indicate that more eels were consumed than all the other types of fish combined. They were also widespread throughout England in the rivers and estuaries and were relatively easy to catch. Eels are seasonally migratory, which means that they spawn upriver in kind of muddy, shallow water areas and in estuaries, and then they make their way downriver to live out the rest of their life cycle in the sea. So they were very predictable in the medieval period and could be caught in cheap to make traps, little more than willow baskets with a sort of funnel entrance which would allow the eels to enter but not leave. So they could literally be pulled out of the river in their hundreds. You are almost certainly aware of the Magna Carta document, 1215. It established things like trial by jury of your peers, the fact that the king is not above the law, all sorts of other things. It also mentions eel traps. In section 33, it specifically talks about eel traps, or it calls them eel bucks, because they were that important. And what it actually does is it specifically outlaws their use in the Thames, the Medway, and all inland rivers in England, but you were allowed to use them on the sea coast. And that was because of overfishing. Eels were sometimes used to pay rent. In the 11th century, some historians think that over 500,000 eels were paid in rent as opposed to money. In 1194, the monks of Ramsey Abbey rented the right to use a roadway, a raised roadway across some marshy land for the use of their abbey. And they negotiated an annual rent. And that annual rent was £2 of spices and ginger, a pair of red trousers, and 1,000 eels a year. That went on for some years until the landowner died and his widow renegotiated the rent. She renegotiated it to half a mark of silver, 60 cartloads of firewood, got rid of the red trousers. I guess she didn't really need red trousers, but kept 1,000 eels. It was obviously useful to her. In the Domesday Book, quite a lot of properties had their rents paid in eels. Now, as you probably imagined, the medieval period had an awful lot of different terminologies for quantities of things. There were no standardised units in those days, well, there were feet and inches and stuff, but there were also furlongs and chains and perkins and barrels and all sorts of different things for different quantities. You might not be surprised to realise that there was a terminology for number of eels. So a bind of eels was 10 and a stick of eels was 25. Now it's possible that 100 eels had its own terminology, but I don't know. I think that might be lost to history. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a special term for 100 eels. But anyway, you could order eels in binds and sticks, which I think is wonderful. Now the eels were typically dried. Dried eels were lighter, took up less space, and if you kept them dry, would last quite a long time, all the way through the winter period. We also have records of eels that were salted and also smoked. I don't know whether they combined the two, but certainly some were salted and some were smoked. But the vast majority were dried and tied into bundles called binds or sticks. And that way they were, well, I guess they were a currency, because there are some places where the rents were an extraordinarily large number of eels when you work it out. We have a record of a series of mills. One particular owner had 2 mills. One of them, the rent was 1,000 sticks, which is 25,000 eels for the year, and the other was 2,000 sticks of eels, 50,000 eels. Now, what one man did with 75,000 eels a year, I don't know. I can't even imagine how much space that took up. I presume he sold them on somehow, or people ate them, but I can't imagine anybody getting through 75,000 eels in 1 year, not even a really big household. Nevertheless, that's the record. Now, back in the day, a stick of eels was worth tuppence or 2p, and that's the equivalent of somewhere around $10, £10-ish. Basically half a dollar each. That means that he was making about $10,000 for one meal and about $20,000 for the other meal, very, very roughly. There are no exact figures because money was very different. What you could buy for what is very difficult to actually analyse, but very roughly gives you an idea. That kind of makes some kind of sense. It sort of fits in with what people might pay today for certain rural properties. There's possibly another reason why eels were so widely eaten and were so popular, and that's to do with religion. The Lenten festival, 40 days before Easter, people were expected to not eat meat. Meat was widely considered to be a lusty food. It was considered to inflame the desires, and it was technically forbidden to most people for that period. But eels were okay. Now, eels don't have any clearly obvious sexual organs for most of the year, and their spawning was a mystery in this period of history. And therefore, there were some theories that they were spontaneously generated out of mud or arose from the skin of other eels. And the whole point was they were considered to be sexless. They were considered to be kind of quite a chaste food. So it all sort of tied together to say, eat eels and you'll be more holy. And I think that's one of the other reasons why eels were so widely eaten. You stuff yourself on eels and feel righteous about it. The Lenten period in the year is obviously a period where lots of people's winter supplies are dwindling. So it kind of makes sense for society to have this semi-enforced, not starvation exactly, but sort of eat the bare minimum. And it kind of makes sense to give you a religious reason to go hungry for this period. It sort of makes going hungry a bit easier, and it's a really good time of the year because there isn't that much food to go around anyway. So even if you wanted to feed yourself fully, unless you were very rich, you probably didn't have as much food as you would really like. Due in part to the scarcity of eels, or the growing scarcity of eels in the British Isles, apart from around the coast, there was actually a big trade in importing eels from the continent, from Europe. In 1392, Richard II reduced the tariffs on eels coming into London. The city of London was growing very rapidly, and I think in part you reduced tariffs on the eels and you sort of encouraged the growth of the city because it's a main staple. But also, the eel population of England was in decline at this stage, and even though Magna Carta had banned a certain amount of the fishing, there was still fishing went on at the coast, but also large quantities of eels were being imported in eel boats. These are eel ships, if you like. These are great vehicles that were partially flooded with salt water and filled with live eels, and they would bring the live eels over in the holds of these flooded ships. Now, interestingly, eels can cope with salty and fresh water in combinations as part of their life cycle. They're able to cope with the changes in salinity, and so they would stay relatively fresh. And they used to moor themselves in the middle of the Thames, and people would come out in boats and buy bucket loads of live eels to take back to London and I guess smoke or pickle or do whatever they would do to them to serve them up. So eel ships were a big medieval thing, but they also went on way, way beyond the medieval period until really roughly the 19th century, when eels started to lose favour in England, and now we hardly eat them at all. There are some places in the East End of London, interestingly, where eels are still considered to be a delicacy. Jellied eels, all sorts of other things. I personally have never eaten them. It's something I might try one day. But people who have eaten them tell me that they are quite chewy, quite an acquired taste, and there are lots and lots and lots of tiny little bones, so the texture is quite odd. Yes, if you've eaten eels, tell me what you think of him. Henry I, King of England, died because he ate too many eels. The term used is a surfeit of eels, and it's possibly lampreys as well, because the sort of sinuous, sort of snake-like fish are described in the same way. But I like to think of it as stuffing yourself full to the gills with lovely crispy eels. His eldest son, his only legitimate heir, died earlier in the White Ship disaster, leaving a big gap in the succession for the throne of England. Stephen and Matilda were vying for the throne of England, and that caused a period of chaos and disruption, to this day called the Anarchy. Even back then, people thought it was a terrible time. They described it as a time when Christ and his angels slept, because the rule of law completely broke down. Robber barons roamed the land, stealing things, and everything was chaos. Civil war raged throughout the land, all because of eating too many eels.